welcome to Bergafest. This is our first weekly interview that we will be having with the collaborators on our upcoming album, In the Brink. We're so excited today to be interviewing our first composer, Ledah Finck, who plays violin with us. So can you tell us about yourself?
So I obviously live in New York right now, but I grew up in North Carolina, and then came to Baltimore for a few years, which, as many of you probably know, is where our quartet formed. So I studied at the Peabody Conservatory. Before that, I went to school in North Carolina for a little while, and I've been composing since I was about 18. Where I grew up was a really small town. I had kind of a funny path into composing. There was a lot of folk and fiddle music where I grew up, so a lot of my time was spent doing that. And I had a band with my sister and our best friend and my dad. And I was writing fiddle tunes from a young age, but I never thought of that as composing. That's just kind of the thing that you do, that everyone does if you're a fiddle player, is you make stuff up, you write tunes, you make arrangements. And it really never occurred to me that living people could compose classical music. I was introduced to new music a tiny bit when I started playing in orchestras, but it was still mostly old men who were writing those pieces. So it wasn't something I ever really identified with myself. But the summer that I turned 18, I went to a summer festival for chamber music, and there was also a composition program at that festival. And so there were 6 people, most of whom were younger than me, who identified themselves as composers. And that just blew my mind, because I had never talked to a person who was a peer of mine that said they composed music. And it really just made something click for me. And that very summer I started writing music more in a classical style for the first time. And I started doing that more and more. I started out writing music for violin that I could just play myself. And eventually, after transferring to Peabody and finishing my undergrad, I actually did a master's in composition. So that was kind of my pathway there. And I still very much consider myself to be a composer as well as a performer. Although I go through different phases of navigating those roles. And I guess that kind of brings us to the piece of mine that we'll be recording for the album, because that's been a really interesting experience, being in both roles within this group.
So In the Brink, tell us how the piece came about.
Well, In the Brink was actually the first piece that I wrote for Bergamot, and we had been playing another quartet that I wrote for a couple of years, but I really wanted to write a piece specifically for Bergamot, because I think we have a set of unique abilities together. And so what ended up happening was we applied for a grant together with a percussionist named Terry Sweeney, who Irene introduced us to. And we ended up getting the grant, and so we suddenly had this freedom for me to just sit down and write like a big piece for us. It's it might actually be the longest piece I've written in terms of like concert music. It's about 20 minutes long, it's in 4 movements. So I really just got to spend, I guess it was the summer of 2019, right? Yeah. Workshopping that piece. We were at the Banff Center together that summer, and we got to play around with a lot of things together. Although I actually wrote most of it when we were not in the same place, which was interesting, then kind of bringing them bits and pieces to try out. But the piece is also kind of semi-related to another work that I had written the year before, which was for like a large mixed ensemble called The Thicket. And both of those pieces deal with themes of communication. That's something I think about a lot when writing. I mean, it's super obvious, but music is, or can be, a very powerful microcosm of ideal kinds of human communication. So what I did with both pieces was I took a little bit of text that was used in various ways within the music. In The Thicket, you don't actually hear the text ever, but it can be provided as a program note. In this one, we actually do some speaking and singing. It's just really short little fragments of text. For The Thicket, it was a Tennyson poem, and this one I wrote the text for. But I really like using natural metaphors, images of nature. In The Brink, I was kind of playing around with this idea of like floods and droughts and just kind of extremes of nature. in a way that relates, at least in my head, to just various conditions that humans are dealing with right now interpersonally, kind of on a large scale. These droughts of connection between people, tendency to be very insular with either with yourself or with groups of people in different ways. So this is kind of just this broad exploration of the violence with which we come together and come apart.
So, as you mentioned, this piece is with Quartet plus drum kit. Could you talk a little bit about what it was like writing for both an ensemble that you obviously know very well because you play in it, as well as for drum kit, which I don't think is an instrument that you play, or unless there's something that we don't know. And it's also a very different instrument, texturally and otherwise, from string quartet. So what was it like writing for both of those, as well as writing for them together for the same piece?
Yeah. Well, it's funny because I often hear composers say that they hate writing for the instrument that they're trained on. And I can never identify with that because for me it's terrifying to write music for instruments that I'm not trained on. Yeah, so I was really like daunted by the prospect of writing for drums, even though it's something the four of us had talked about a lot wanting to do. We all love percussion music, and our collaborator Terry is an amazing percussionist. And the first like hurdle for me was just deciding what kind of percussion instrument or instruments to use, because anything can be a percussion instrument. I actually first was thinking that I would make a sort of like setup of or palette of just found objects, but I felt like that might be restrictive. I don't know. I think it would still be fun to try out. but I actually eventually settled on drum kit because part of the reason for that was because we were planning to tour this piece last summer, which this got canceled for obvious reasons, but we were planning to tour it in the South, where Sarah and I are from, and we really wanted to play in kind of community centers as much as possible versus classical concert halls. And we thought that having a drum kit be part of our ensemble could be just a really interesting kind of point of connection for people. We play a lot of new music, so it's not what you expect when you hear classical string quartet often. And I think just the sight of us playing with drum kit further kind of removes us from like classical imagery and sound. So you expect something when you see a drum kit, but I also kind of wanted to subvert that expectation, and I don't use the drum kit in drum kit-y sort of ways very often in the piece. Yeah. I really wanted to integrate it into the string quartet as much as possible. So while there's very little sounds happening from the drum kit outside of just kind of the traditional components of the kit, cymbals, kick drum, snare, etc. I tried to write in sort of a melodic way for the drum kit, and I also have us doing percussive things. We clap at various points, and there's a lot of rhythmic elements that the quartet carries too. So that actually helped me kind of narrow down the writing I wanted to do for the quartet. Was just for the kit, was thinking about it in the context of the quartet and how I can make our five sounds coalesce together.
I liked how you talked about the idea of like the classical versus new music or versus non-classical kind of thing. And I mean, as a quartet, we do try to situate ourselves, like we understand that the string quartet is such a old tradition. It comes out of the classical tradition, obviously. And I guess just curious with your own writing, like I know you mentioned that you also like came from a fiddle background, and just wondering with how like the music that you wrote in the Brink, because that's like, I don't know, I think it's really interesting that I think it could go either way in terms of like classical or new music. I was just like wondering where you situate yourself right now as a composer, or like how you want to do that.
That's a good question. I really kind of struggle with that because I feel like I've kind of moved pretty far away from my classical training in some ways, although I still rely on it quite heavily to do the things that we do together playing wise. It's been a long time since I really listened to traditional classical music or even played much of it. Traditional being music written more than like a couple hundred years ago, I would say. I feel like it's a work in progress. I definitely I really appreciate the fact that I think classical music, to people who are in classical music, has become a vaguer and vaguer term these days. And I wonder how people related to that concept like 50 years ago, say, when like there were tons of composers who were very much playing with crossing out of and over into different genres and very overtly blending influences. But in some ways it's feeling like it might be getting easier for me to identify as a classical composer because classical means so many things. But then again, to kind of a broader audience, it still means something pretty specific. So, I don't know. I guess what I wish is that one didn't really have to either identify it as a performer or a composer, or even a performer-composer. Yeah, I don't think I answered the question very well, but...
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
I'm really curious, you mentioned that there was text both for the thicket and for In the Brink, but in the Brink we actually really hear the text a lot, and I would love to hear about how that was developed. Did you write it? Did you find it somewhere? You know, what was that process like for you?
Yeah, it was kind of found in a way, although most of it was stuff that I wrote down. There's just like a couple of lines of text for each of the 4 movements, and the text you hear at the end of the first movement actually was something I overheard. And I don't want Irene to cry when I say But I used to play quite regularly at a retirement home, and once a man walked into the room where I was playing and he said, "I'm terribly afraid of becoming lost." And he just kind of said that phrase to the room. And this isn't actually funny because it was really sad. But it was just so like profound. I don't know, there's something about this phrase that this man just said to the room was just like really stuck with me, and I wrote it down, and then years later I just felt that it was incredibly evocative and incredibly appropriate for this piece that I was writing. So that's the first text you hear in the piece is, "I'm terribly afraid of becoming lost." I'm sorry, it's not the first thing you hear. We kind of say, like, where are we? Where am I? There's kind of these like little fragments that are circulating throughout the ensemble.
Yeah.
Something I like that I think when we perform it is it's not always clear who's saying what, and they're kind of intermingled.
Like
but then that other sentence we all say together at the end of the movement. And the text in the second movement is just a couple of lines that I wrote that kind of deal with this like aggression, like flood, drought. We shout a lot. It's fun. The third movement has no text. It's the one that doesn't, but it does have a lot of improv, which was really fun to develop together. And super chaotic. And then in the last movement, we sing for the first time, and the text there is, "We hold each other in the brink of all our questions." And to me, this was kind of a hopeful line, and had some kind of mixed meanings. I thought that it conveyed confusion and uncertainty, but also a sense of hope and togetherness. So yeah, what my goal with that text was really just to kind of encapsulate the overall metaphorical message of the piece.
So, since you're writing this piece for us, I just want to ask, what was the most enjoyable thing about writing for a quartet or musicians that you work so closely with, and also the most challenging thing? To be very honest.
Well, like I mentioned earlier, I definitely feel like very safe writing for strings, and especially for you guys, because I know you're playing and your personalities very well. And I felt comfortable taking some risks, which have been a gamble when writing for other ensembles, where I'm not totally sure of their comfort level with certain things. So, like, I knew that y'all would be game to do some vocalizing, and I had a chance to ask Amy before I wrote it if she was okay with someone drumming on her instrument strings. Stuff like that, and I mean, it was also just really nice having like total freedom when being like, hey, can we try this out? Like whenever I wanted, because mostly when you're writing for an ensemble, you have like very limited opportunity to workshop stuff. It was challenging. Gosh, I mean, this is gonna sound stupid, but like maybe just I was putting a lot of pressure on myself to write something like really good because this is my first Bergamot commission, and I really hope that I can write more stuff for us, and I'm sure I will. / we're working on something together right now, which I'm excited about. But yeah, I second guess things kind of more than I usually do, I think, just because I knew we'd get to perform it a lot and maybe record it someday, and I really wanted it to be as good as it could be.
So you live in New York City and you're in a string quartet. What are your other projects you're working on right now?
Well, it's been kind of a while since I wrote for an ensemble, actually. I've really kind of been going inward this past year. The first thing that came to mind to mention, actually, I just realized was like over a year ago now, which feels crazy, but I released my first solo album last February. Had a live stream album release. And that I feel like kind of marked a turning point for me just within my own music making. Kind of finally letting myself explore writing in more kind of away from like a classical idiom, working with a much more experimental style, playing in a much folkier way, singing a bunch, and just like actually writing songs. So I've been working on some stuff in that vein since I released my album, which you can find on Bandcamp. Maybe I'll get it on Spotify one of these days. It's called Mayfly. I've been working on some other stuff that's kind of along the same vein, just using instruments that are not the violin or viola, which are the ones that I'm good at. I've kind of been getting increasingly more experimental with the stuff that I record, and it's been fun just sitting in my house and recording stuff and trying out things and writing lyrics and making videos too. I've actually been making a bunch of music videos.
I love your videos.
I just released a song called The Way, which actually used a poem by my grandma. And that one has a video that goes with it. It's on YouTube and whatnot. And I'm mostly just doing that kind of stuff these days. Yeah, that's pretty much it for the moment.
Cool.
That's a lot.
So we have one more question for you. Last night at our listening party as part of Bergafest, we listened to some of your other music, which is super exciting. Really nice to dive into that. And it made us curious, what are you listening to these days?
I always get nervous when I get asked that question. Well, I'm trying to think of what I've been listening to recently because I feel like it changes drastically every day. What did we listen to in the car on the way here?
So many
things. That's long, right?
I think probably one of the artists that I've been getting most excited about recently is Colin Stetson, the saxophone player. Like every time I listen to one of his albums, my mind is just blown because there are just crazy things that happen when he plays saxophone. Also, I was kind of revisiting the Carolina Chocolate Drops recently, which is an amazing folk band that originated from very near where I grew up in North Carolina. What else? I just bought a Madonna tape. That was fun. And I found this other record recently of a Storyteller from Appalachia, which was super fun. So that's not music, but I just really love storytelling.
Yeah.
Yeah, we were listening together to
Fiona Apple.
Yes, Fiona Apple's latest album is so good. And I've kind of been discovering her earlier music through that, and just like talking to everyone I know about it. Yeah.
So much good music. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for talking with us today. in this setting. We talk to you a lot. And thank all of you for joining us for this first Bergafest interview. We'll have these interviews weekly, but our next event is this coming Monday. It'll be our first Bergafest mini concert. So you can find us at 7 p.m. Eastern Time on our social media. You can find information on our website or probably wherever you found this video. So hope to see you there.